Thank you. Okay, so as I was saying, we have some fantastic panelists today. First off, we have my colleague, Melanie Lindenmeyer, who will be sharing and presentation duties with me. She is our Vice President of Regulatory Compliance Audit and Training. We also have Chris Messakar, Vice President of Enrollment at Core Education. We have Brian Stanley, Director of Hospitality at Sweetbriar College. And we have Sarah Johnson, Vice President of Admissions at Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. And I'm the Director of Growth and Partnerships here at FA Solutions, as well as Educational Compliance Management. And just to give you a little bit of background on who we are, if this is your first time dealing with us, we are a full-service financial aid third-party servicer, but we're so much more than that. We support institutions in the entire enrollment cycle, from talking to students and helping them through the admissions process, getting documentation in, to reviewing their compliance documentation and assisting schools with the awarding and compliance pieces of the financial aid office. We also can come in and support institutions by doing financial aid office assessments. If you are looking for efficiencies in the office, if you're wondering if you're using your leverage technology and processes correctly, all of that are things that we can and have helped schools with. We have a great wealth of knowledge here at FA Solutions and ECM on our staff and our leadership team. We have each one of our leadership team members probably has around 30 plus years of experience actually in financial aid offices. And so we haven't just had that experience working as a third-party servicer, but our team has actually been at the colleges and institutions. So we want to ensure that we're always giving that up-to-date information that is touching campuses right now, which is why we've also tapped in on our colleagues who are currently at institutions and dealing with some of these situations on a daily basis. So that's who we are as a company and why we're putting this on today. It's so important to engage with students all throughout the enrollment process. And we want to make sure that we're giving out all of our clients and our friends in our network the tools to do that. So today we have,
Katie,
yes.
can I interrupt 1 second? I think you're not in presenter mode, so it's showing like 2 slides instead of one.
Oh,
big slide. So I just wanted to make sure that they could see the 1 slide so that it's bigger on their screen.
okay, that's what I was worried about. Let me see if I can fix that. That was the piece that I was worried about. I can't. Let's see. Let's cross our fingers here. What can you see now?
There you go. It says the
Okay, thank
agenda.
you. Technical
Thank you.
difficulties. I
Great job.
appreciate that. Yes, that other view is extremely distracting. Thank you, Melanie.
You're
Okay.
welcome.
So our agenda today, the blueprint overview, is the big buckets are the rapport and discovery, and that would be with your students as you go through the process, as you learn about not just the individual students, but and we'll go over this on the slides, but the personas of those students. The second bucket that we'll be talking about is deadlines and compliance. And then our third bucket will be on communication and continuity of support throughout the student's enrollment cycle. From first conversation to alumni, every step needs both structure and humanity. So really that empathy needs to touch every piece of the student engagement process, as well as the interaction that each person at the institution who has that engagement, the empathy between those people as well, and that will ensure the continuity of experience for the students. So first off, we're going to talk about that student rapport. Different populations bring in those different expectations. And this is where we start to talk about personas. It's kind of a marketing term, which means understanding who your student is, what their goals and desires are, what their pain points are, why they are choosing your institution, what their barriers to joining your institution might be, what are common issues, and knowing what is different about students in not only your institution, but also maybe specific programs. For example, we have a question down here at the bottom that says, do they need a parent support for the conversation or decision making? That is a persona specific question. If you're asking that question and all of the students in this program are older, returning back into the workforce, you might be asking the wrong question. If you're going off older information, or you've got someone new in the process that doesn't really understand the student, you can have a mismatch between the conversation that you're starting with the student from any point in the process and the empathy around that engagement with the student. So it requires tailoring to what feels supportive to that student. Sarah, I wanted to see if you ever had experience at Rocky Mountain, or any of your prior experience with either a positive or a negative in understanding the student and the student experience.
Sure. Thanks, Katie. I want to give a shout out. There's a few people on in attendees that I know, so thank you for coming. Hi, friends. My name is Sarah Johnson. I work at Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design, but those of us who are on the panel today have all worked together in some capacity. And I think that I would speak for probably all of us when I say that we feel like discovery is probably one of the most important parts of the enrollment process. It completely sets the tone for the student experience. One thing I would say, Katie, is that in your discovery, while it has to be customized to the student persona, I think you can build a really good basic framework for discovery that works for everyone, that gives you sort of a standard and consistent approach to finding out information that you need in order to help your students. So, for example, we always say that we want to understand where a student's been, where they are now, and where they want to be personally and professionally through their education. And that can be applied to every type of student, whether they're first gen, adult learners, veterans, reentry students, because what we're really trying to find out is where their work, educational, and personal history have led them to where they are at this moment, and how that determines what they're looking for in a college, what they're looking for in a program, what they're looking for in a career, etc. And I would just end with saying, I would argue that it's far more important to understand why the student's sitting in front of you in this moment of discovery than it is to even understand what their program of interest is. Everybody has been led to us for a specific reason, and for us to sort of uncover that is to really understand the student's greatest need. So hopefully that helps. Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially about understanding the difference between what brought them to this point versus a specific program of study. So I really appreciate you bringing that forth. And to go back to Sarah's point, students expect to be heard and understood as individuals. Again, maybe not even as a student in a particular program. Maybe they just know they want to change. They don't know what they want that change to be. They know they have a goal or a vision of what they want to be. And sitting there with the counselor, whether they're academic, admissions, financial aid, just hearing what they want out of life, who they want to be, we can help guide them, whatever path that is. And again, that means giving clear and honest guidance on those academic, financial, and programmatic career requirements, again, without jargon, because I know that I'm probably saying this to people that definitely understand it, but it gets so easy when we've been in this industry for so long, or at our particular institution for any period of time, to use even jargon that we don't hear as jargon anymore. And so just making sure that we're having those conversations with empathy and giving the student that information that they need. Listening actively, again, understanding those questions that we need to ask, and then providing those tailored solutions. And a lot of this will be second nature for those of us that have been in the industry or at the institution for any period of time. But I also encourage schools to have documentation, especially about those conversation flows between departments. I don't want to step on any other part of this presentation, but I feel like it's very important for each step in the process to understand how their portion of the student communication piece and their responsibilities with what information they need to provide to the student and communication also needs to be known and understood by their partner divisions at the school, whether you have a one-stop or not. Understanding what information academics needs, or what information financial aid needs, and what each of those departments is telling students in the process will help that communication be cohesive and the handoff be wonderful every time the student transitions from one to another person. Now, I do know that some institutions have one buddy counselor that walks the student through the whole process, or that they can ask questions to, but a lot of times that's not the case. So those transitions and handovers become very important, as well as the consistency and warmth. So all of those things together will create a transformational student experience, from those effective interactions to not just working on overcoming objections, but understanding what that student's true reason for being there is, around transparency, as well as accountability with that communication structure for us as the school. So before I pass this over to Melanie, Sarah, you shared such great insight. Anything else that came up as I was wrapping up those last two slides?
I thought of something. Have you guys seen the on Instagram, like unpopular opinion? It's like one of my favorite segments. I have an unpopular opinion, which is small talk is overrated. And so what I mean by that is, you know, oftentimes admissions folks especially think that small talk is rapport, and rapport is ultimately building trust. And while it's great to have common interest, it's actually really that sort of active listening, that structured, well-led conversation that builds trust. This student is making a major decision at the conclusion of our discovery, right? And what's going to make them feel more confident to do that is really by us asking intentional and thoughtful questions designed to really understand their values, their goals, their needs. I often coach admissions people who have like 10-minute sidebar conversations about their cats. And I'm like, that's cool, but I promise you it's a bit overrated, and they get confused as to why the student never calls them back or doesn't progress in the enrollment process. And it's like, cats alone are not enough to bond us together. So anyway, small talk is overrated is my unpopular opinion. So thanks for letting me speak up on that, Katie.
That might be the quote of the presentation: cats alone are not enough to bond us together. I think that's the quote of the day. Thank you so much, Sarah. Over to you, Melanie.
I would argue that dogs are very bonding though, so maybe that example would have worked. So now that we've explored how to build the rapport and understand student needs, we kind of want to shift to the second pillar, which is preparedness, deadlines, and compliance. This is where deadlines, compliance, and proactive communication come into play. To me, it's about ensuring students are not caught off guard by deadlines or requirements, and how you create transparent, supportive environment where they feel informed and empowered. Again, kind of to Sarah's point, these are things that build trust and reduce anxiety, hopefully with these students, and help you to kind of move into the next step. So breaking the silos across departments, to me, and I think to everybody that's been a part of this process, like silos are really one of the biggest threats to student retention. A bottleneck in one office can create a drop off completely in another, and you might not even know what happened with that student. It could just be because of that drop off that didn't impact you or your department. When we think about student success, I think most of us probably focus on the obvious: admissions, financial aid, the registrar. Those are all what we like see. But the reality is really that every student touches the student experience. So as an example, I think like IT, if the portal isn't intuitive or accessible, students would disengage. Counseling services, mental health support is directly tied to retention. Human resources might not seem important, but staff training and culture affect how the students are treated and kind of how the whole environment at the school is in general. And so thinking about how cross-departmental collaboration as a retention to strategy and not just an operational fix. So I don't know, Chris, I'm sure you have plenty that you can add. So what are things that you've got to run into and want to add to that?
I would, thanks, Melody. I mean, this for me, when I especially was a president, became a very utilizable tool across the entire campus. Many folks, especially if you're thinking on the front end, many folks within the school think of it in terms of, well, that's financial aid and that's admissions who are responsible for starting students. And then other departments, including financial aid, are responsible for keeping students. But this this graph here, or this image here, really kind of represents that the entire school is responsible for recruitment, retention, and graduation, because each one of those bubbles that you see there actually indicates or is a potential point of failure in that student journey. And so helping as you're onboarding new folks, or really just utilizing this as that discussion point across the campus, like if you stop and think about it, each one of those bubbles represents a person or persons that have to interact with that student and or family potentially in order for them to get started at school and then potentially stick in school. If you have housing, then that can fall into an entirely different department that might not even be represented here. So making sure that everybody is aligned, that every single person on that campus recruits, retains, and helps students graduate is extremely powerful, and something that can become a powerful mantra, because then that will positively impact your working together on the communications, which I think you're going to get into here shortly, Melanie.
I personally love that financial aid was the biggest bubble on that, just because that has my heart. And obviously I wasn't always that, but that kind of makes me laugh. But also to your point, like that doesn't mean financial aid is where everything ends up or why the student makes a decision. So I just think that's funny because I never get to see that as a very important like piece in that puzzle.
But
I
it
don't
is,
know.
I would
It
say,
is.
Mel, it is the fulcrum. Like
Yep.
I've always viewed financial aid as the epicenter for problem
Mhm.
solving, both on the front end, if we're bringing the student in, or if, you know, the campus is really humming in terms of their cross-functional communication. Like if there's problems, most students have the financial aid or financial challenges. So being able to bring them back to financial aid and work through those possible solutions that maybe students couldn't see themselves is
Right.
critical. So I would agree with you.
Which
Like
it,
it's true.
yeah, and a good point too is if there's anyone kind of newer on the webinar, like that's why I do think it's just as important to teach kind of problem solving and that skill set to financial aid, which sometimes people look at them as just black and white. And so it is important that they have kind of those skills as well, just like all the other departments. I don't know, Katie, there was a question in the chat. Do you want that kind of has to do with this? Do you want me to go through that quick before we move to the next slide? You're on mute, Katie.
So sorry. Yes, it
Oh,
says,
it's okay.
I work in
Okay.
student services, and sometimes it is hard to get faculty to understand the logistics of what we might be trying to do with students to faculty. How can we better communicate that?
I'm certain any of our panelists could probably speak up to that if any of you want to.
I would start with the faculty's why. Typically, it's going to be students. You know, they want their students to succeed, but then also framing it in that reference point for what are their KPIs. There's our retention, right? So being able to talk about students' needs and helping them in some instances might even be anticipating potential student needs that happen throughout, you know, a particular term or seasonality that has to be with those students' needs. But then also helping them understand how that can help them keep a student in school and thus in their classes. Also helps at times connect those dots that, oh, well, of course, the student's always, you know, the epicenter for everything that we do, but there's also something in it for me, meaning my roster stays the same size or, you know, in future terms might be larger because of my interactions with financial aid. But the student benefits the most. So starting and ending there always.
I'll share one quick tip too. I think that faculty, sometimes they're in their bubble. They're experts and really know their topic that they're leading forward. And we from other departments around campus we assume they understand the admissions, the financial aid, and different services that we provide. A lot of time, if we've not educated them or trained them, they're not familiar with this and feel very uncomfortable having to talk about those topics with students. So they kind of shy away because they're not an expert. And I think it's really important as a campus or institution to think about that. Just some high level tips and training that can help the entire campus move forward and see the importance of these can make a huge difference with that retention piece for sure. So just something, from many years, I definitely see they're experts in a lot of areas. Financial aid admissions, they're not.
If your campuses do lunch and learns for the faculty, it might be worthwhile to offer to be part of those lunch and learn series, or, depending on what type of calendar you're on, quarterly, semesterly kickoffs, finding some time on those agendas as well, to be able to plug yourself in as a resource, or department as a resource can also be beneficial, to Brian's point.
Great. Perfect, guys. All right, moving into the cross-functional calendar, which probably seems really basic and maybe not something everybody thinks about, but I do think that it is important to know that your departments are operating on one calendar, that you're sharing it amongst the school. It's not just one calendar for one department, one for another, because these misaligned timelines between admissions, financial aid, registrar, academics lead to funnel links, where if you have a calendar that's visible to both students and staff, you can eliminate some of that. And it's not about necessarily syncing the dates, but more about syncing the intentions and the expectations so that everybody is on the same page. The benefits, I would say, for a unified calendar are it improves internal coordination. The staff can plan and they can outreach kind of in tandem. Like I mentioned already, it reduces funnel leaks because students are less likely to miss key steps when the deadlines are aligned. I know just because financial aid is where I've spent the bulk of my career, there are so many deadlines there that some people think that that's the only deadline and forget that there are deadlines in other pieces that also impact the students. So trying to get those aligned will help them to not be as confused, and maybe they feel more confident when they see the full journey laid out and all the transparency of what they need to be doing to get things accomplished. Because we all know for the student, like, it's very overwhelming, especially if it's their first experience and they have no idea really what they're getting into sometimes and what kind of all the steps are, and it can seem very overwhelming. And I think this also helps support compliance and ensures that, like, the regulatory deadlines are met across departments, on top of just making sure that we're servicing the students. So if this feels overwhelming, I would say start small if you don't have this, and maybe pilot a shared calendar between financial aid and admissions, or pick whichever departments, but start with a couple of departments and then kind of expand as you go so that it doesn't feel as overwhelming. And then just know that if you're trying to get buy-in across departments, because I know sometimes that's hard too, help everybody to understand that that alignment just helps prevent attrition and improves the student confidence in the institution. Because I think if you can tie it back to that, sometimes it helps them to understand why you're doing that. I don't know, Chris?
I was just going to say, one other thing I'd add to that slide. I experienced it with a school that I was working with, is everything you just said, and then getting to that point, if possible, to where you're even coordinating your messaging around those timelines. And what I mean by that, I discovered at a school that I worked with that, every single functional area was sending messaging to the students. This was a semester-based school. They were sending them multiple messages from multiple departments all at the same time. And so it just became such visual clutter for the students that they didn't respond because they were just paralyzed. And what finally brought it to me was a student who was on a family vacation out of the country, came back, had something like 80 messages from various departments that were trying to get things accomplished. And luckily the student called in instead of just disappearing. And the poor student was so overwhelmed that he didn't know where to start. And so at least they reached out via the phone to ask where to start. And so that drove us meeting as departments, combining our information all into one comm so that it was much clearer for the students. So if you're nowhere near that, I would say that could be the next iteration, if you're starting small, to be thinking about that as you're building this process as well.
Valuable point. So this is, of course, just one case study, but as shown here, we all probably kind of know these numbers just from dealing with it, that once a student withdraws, over 50% never return, and only 33% of those returnees graduate. I know all the panelists here that I've worked with in the past, we've seen this happen, you know, in our time together. I'm sure you continue to see it, where students really need to stay in school in order to kind of get to that graduation mark, and we sort of lose them kind of every time that they leave. But with all of the two slides that we kind of talked through before this, like that helps you to kind of understand that retention is everyone's job. Like, I think that's just another point, again, that we've been trying to go through the steps to get there, but it isn't just one department. And we have to communicate as a whole, as an institution, to really make sure that we're doing the best things for the students, and that we're trying to have meaningful conversations and support them ahead of time before they disengage, so that we're not trying to chase them later after they've kind of already are either so overwhelmed or kind of have one foot out the door, that we're trying to catch them early and have those conversations or see the warning signs, so that we can help them to figure out, you know, sometimes it could just be a small thing that's big to them, but maybe you can help them break it down with a conversation where there's a way for them to stay in school, maybe not exactly in the same way that they are currently in school, but in a way that they can still be part of the community, stay in school, stay engaged, and then helps them continue, hopefully, to be engaged instead of just kind of giving up and throwing their hands up. So I don't know if there's some examples of like what early inclusion looks like at your current institution for any of the panelists, or for Chris, like what you've seen at schools, because I know that you work with a lot of schools too. So what you've seen, or maybe what from your past.
Sure. I think, you know, institutionally landing on what that looks like, I've seen early warning systems that, you know, start in academics or student services, to where it goes to a larger retention-based team that is cross-functional in nature, so that there is that fast. I've seen it done via, and nobody likes shared Excel files, but I've seen it, depending on the size of the school, done it. I've seen it done there. I've seen it done within software systems as well, and within SISs, so that, or student information systems, so that across multiple functions, folks are having escalations happening soon, and right away, with the expectation set that there's something that is resolved. And that's a key point. Like, what is our service level agreement internally? Like, is this a 24-hour solve? Is this a 48-hour solve? So that we can get that in front of the students as soon as humanly possible. Because if it surfaces, they're already moving on potentially in their mind. So how quickly can we triage it and help head that off at the pass, especially if you have a student who might be juggling multiple things in their lives. If they're an adult student, this just becomes one of those reasons why, well, I knew I couldn't do it, or, you know, I've heard this over the years, it's a sign from above, which always made me cringe. And so just early, and interdepartmental communication is key, because that means you have multiple sets of eyes out there and ears, and it's not just falling on one department.
Can I add to what Chris said, Melanie? He said early, and I was like, yeah, as early as the admissions process. So
Yep.
this is another one of those things that makes me think of culturally how a school can be okay with students just pushing their start forward and forward and forward and forward. And we know statistically that the longer a student waits to start school, the less likely they are to start. And so culturally, if we can sort of start that problem solving early on, between admissions and our other department partners, that'll cascade to withdrawals and retention down the line. So just the early thing, Chris, it triggered me.
I think it helps too to understand, like, if you're starting that early and everybody is having those conversations, even in that process, it's happening then hopefully across the whole institution, because it's just the culture then and becomes how you do things, which we all know kind of makes everything a little bit easier if we're all on the same page and kind of doing things as a whole, even from the very beginning. So that's a great point. So moving on to compliance and transparency. Basically, and I think I'm very kind of passionate about this myself, is students shouldn't have to chase down answers. When we lead with transparency, we build their trust. And when we build their trust, we hopefully retain the student. Those are all things that we need to make sure that we're doing as a whole. And making sure that they have as much information and clear information is very important. So, of course, deadlines. Don't wait for the students to ask you when they can do their FAFSA, like make sure you're posting deadlines. Use automation nudges. I think we talked about, multiple channels and visual timelines, but making sure that you're using all those to communicate with the student. I think we have so many options and ways to communicate with students now that makes it a little bit easier. Of course, we don't want to be overwhelming with all of those communications, but we have multiple ways to communicate with students where it used to be only maybe a more singular way to do that. And so as an example too, if a student who misses like a payment deadline and they may may disengage entirely, just timely reminders help prevent that. I think in a lot of cases, we just think that one reminder works or they know because someone told them, but we have to continue to communicate and be transparent. With academics and early check-ins, we talked about that a little bit earlier. Faculty and advisors should be part of that early alert system, making sure that, again, we're doing things right when we see them and not waiting to see if they show up down the road. If it's, an attendance taking school and we're expecting to see them as an example, or even if we start out on the admissions and financial aid side, if they're not showing up for meetings or phone calls that they had committed to, making sure that we are following up and not just letting things go, and encouraging collaborations between academics and the student services team, which we talked about earlier in the call too, which I think is another important piece. And then, of course, with financial aid, again, being transparent with all of the information. Financial aid is very overwhelming for a lot of students. So making sure that we're being very transparent, using plain language, giving them updates, letting them know when they need to do things, reminding them if they maybe didn't have to do something, but now, like as verification, for an example, if they're selected for something and now have to turn in more, communicating with those things and just making sure that we're always transparent and reducing to help reduce their anxiety and be more communicative in all of these things. I think that sometimes we also take the thought of, oh, well, FSA is sending out things to students. They're getting things from studentaid.gov. From a financial aid perspective, we don't also need to remind them, but we do because they get so many emails. They don't see all those things. And we all know different students use different communication tactics. So hopefully you have ideas about what works for your student population too. And then also, like we've talked about, the pre-warnings to support the before the crisis. I think we've touched on that a lot, but I don't know if there's other things that you can think through, but just making sure also, like if a GPA dips or they're missing classes or they're just kind of not doing things that they were normally doing, making sure that we're following up with the student and making sure that we're doing whatever we can. I think that prepared students are retained students, and transparency isn't really just a regulatory requirement. It's really a retention strategy, I would say. So just making sure that you're all thinking through those pieces. I don't know if anyone has anything else to add on that, but I do think it's stuff we pretty much already covered in the other two slides. But Brian, do you have something?
I was just going to share, I think sometimes getting messages out on social media, continuing to with text messaging, a lot of us have a CRM. It's just making sure that the cross departments know that that type of information is going out. But I also think with social media that parents and families and support systems, they see that also to help remind that student that, hey, I got to get my FAFSA done, or I need to add the school code, or just as an example. So just making sure that that social media piece is out there and following that same timeline so that that support system's there to help them through those next steps.
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. Which kind of leads us a little bit into our last section, which is our communication and continuity. So not just the communication between departments, but also the communication out there on social media, on websites. Again, there's just so much noise that we all deal with, and in order to ensure that we are keeping engaged with the students, providing them with the information that they need for wherever they are in the process, or letting them know about information that is needed to move through the process, that handoff and communication is going to be critical. And this is definitely a summation of what we had talked about previously. So going back to that clarity that Melanie was referring to, and I always think, from Brene Brown, clear is kind. So that empathy for the student of understanding, yes, we know what all the deadlines are and we know exactly what they need to do. And sometimes we know that the process is very simple, but when you're new to that process, or even new to a specific way of doing the process, for example, FAFSA simplification, I think there have definitely been some improvements there, but boy, that first year was really rough. And communicating to students who might have done their first year under the old FAFSA and the second year under the simplified FAFSA probably didn't feel too simple to them. So again, just setting up the students and families for success by providing clarity in the deadlines and that constant proactive outreach on all channels, including socials. And we'll get to this on a later slide, but the technology piece of it is very important, as students may have their account with the school, but they might check their personal account more, and they might have different personal accounts, and they might not check their email very much at all because that's something old people use. And so they're only looking at their texts. And so then you have to text them, or, send them some sort of push notification from some sort of app. So it's all just that next step of making sure that you're in front of them with the information that they need in order to be successful and not have that drop off, and to prevent the mixed deadlines, to eliminate the use of jargon as much as possible. We know we're trying to send these short messages, so sometimes we try to shortcut things, but making sure that we're not missing those pieces that the students and families need in order to take action and stay engaged with the process. And of course, not being reactive, but being very proactive and thinking about how your students, and maybe even that student in particular, engages. So that internal handoff, that communication strategy, that's all going to be a piece of how you stay engaged with students throughout the process. And even your alumni, a big piece of empathy going out to all of the students that are in repayment and all of the confusing parts of that. Institutions that have direct student loans have a certain amount of responsibility for their students who have previously attended, in order to make sure that they have the information to know who has their loans, when they need to start repaying them, what their repayment options are now, what their repayment options will be in the future if they're not a borrower yet. So all of those pieces are a critical part of staying engaged with the student the entire time. And we will be leveraging the technology, but also that human training to provide the correct pieces of data at the correct time for the students. So compliance is important to remember. It's not paperwork, it's daily interaction. It's ensuring that you have clear benchmarks for what you need from students and when. That's communicated to the students, that's communicated before it's needed, and it's communicated multiple times. But then also training the staff to blend that human warmth with the process, because again, these students and families, they don't know what we know. They don't know what the consequences will be about not completing whatever it is, their registration, their verification, their FAFSA, their admissions paperwork within a certain time frame, or even I think Melanie was referring to, payment benchmarks and the consequences of that, but relaying what can happen if these benchmarks aren't met, with that empathy, and regulation safe answers, meaning make sure you're accurate in what you're saying. Again, maybe going back to the cats, try not to have so much small talk, try not to be as open-ended as you think you might want to be very clear. When a deadline is a deadline, don't make it seem like it's a suggestion. Be very clear that it is a deadline. Because again, non-compliant communication is not going to help the student. It might make you feel better, or you might not feel as icky about not having to communicate a hard deadline, but it's only going to end up hurting the student in that case. So I know that I've been talking a lot. There were a couple of slides and we want to make sure we get through all of them. You guys have been such great panelists. I didn't think that we were going to be getting this close to the end, but I do want to throw it to Brian, and based on what we've been talking about, and I know you actually spoke to this a little bit before on the last slide, but I'd love to hear your insights for this piece as well, that technology-centric communication.
Sure. I think one of the things that we build in my past experiences, we put a chat feature on our website. So it's interesting to see what questions people are asking at all hours of the day. And what it did for me was open my eyes to say, hey, we've got to make sure that our team and other teams around campus know how to answer some of these questions and feel comfortable answering these questions. We've all been in a new position, and it's like we get information overload, and we're not going to remember or retain everything that was shared in that first couple of weeks in that role. So it's important to, from a training standpoint, to bring that back. If you have a weekly meeting, if you have a daily huddle with your team, and also pulling in other departments to have that communication on how to respond and feel comfortable. A lot of times in admissions, we have folks that tend to be right out of college or tend to be, new to admissions to other areas around campus. So the first time somebody asks them that question about what, I saw your graduation rate was this, they're like, what is a graduation rate? How do I respond to that? So I think it's important to make sure that we're educating, training, and walking through those examples consistently and really as those questions come up. So again, I think the world of AI can help us create some quick FAQs if we don't already have those, and continue to walk through those. Again, I think it's also important to ensure that we go back over those because things change, something happens. We all know how the FAFSA process in the past couple of years has changed very quickly. So I think it's important for us to continue to educate, train our team so they feel knowledgeable and comfortable. The family, if somebody can't answer these questions, they're going to know it. And they're going to be turned off probably by somebody not knowing those answers. They want to know, they're asking for a reason. So that training and education is so important for us to be able to move forward.
Thanks, Brian. I want to touch lightly on, there's a couple of topics that could be, this really harkens back to the last slide, but there could be high risk topics. These are topics that you might know about at your institution that can really cause challenges for students or families, and they might need to discuss those topics in order to decide on enrollment. So again, I think Brian was just addressing this, the authenticity and the education of your team to be able to address specific topics that might be barriers for students. That could be FAQs, that could be any sort of even escalations, like maybe the frontline people don't need to deal with these high risk topics, but they need to know what one sounds like so that they can escalate it to their supervisor, because that is a way that you could lose out on a student, or, I hate to say it, cause harm to them because they've gotten incorrect information, or they're not feeling safe enough to discuss that. So any of the things, it could be personal. It could also be just something as far as the accreditation status of their prior transfer credits, needing to know the job outcomes. And I think Brian was talking about that, needing to know the graduation rate, needing to know the job outcomes, tuition and fees, financial aid and graduation rates, what certifications will they need, what certifications might be part of the program. All of that is part of what they would need to know in order to make that decision. And again, any of these high-risk topics you want to avoid pressure or unethical behaviors. And in some departments, there's more of a temptation there, but not to sugarcoat or soften the edges of something that, again, is a high-risk topic or something that they absolutely need to know is absolutely critical. I think we have a couple more slides, but I felt like this one was so important. I might want to spend a little bit of extra time on this one. So I'm going to open it up to the panelists again for some conversation on this one.
I think the transfer of credit, I would just share right now, especially having spent 30 plus years in private education, the public universities, the community colleges are so in the know of each other right now. And I think we used to stand off when we would talk about transfer credit. We didn't have a lot always on the private side in the institutions that I've worked for to talk about. And I think in order to get that population of students, they're so important. Students are transferring a lot more often than they ever have in our history. So I would say from a transfer of credit, if you have somebody at your campus who's responsible for leading transfer credit, having that person coming in to speak to the team and educating both admissions and financial aid, because it impacts what they're going to be receiving, is such an important piece. And these students, I will tell you, they want answers immediately. They don't want to wait. They're going to the next place because the other schools already have that information ready to hand to them. So I think one big takeaway on that transfer piece is just being in the know, having scholarship amounts or how you're going to work that population. Saying you're going to get back to them, you've lost them to another college in today's world. So that's one big takeaway that took us some time to figure out, but I think we've learned, and it's made a huge impact on our starts classes beginning with that piece. The other thing on here is just the career services and making sure that we know what types of jobs. The big question parents in particular want to know, what are you going to do after college? The students probably not as much, but just making sure you know what those outcomes are for those students will help the parents and families or support systems help them make that decision a little bit quicker. So just two tips there that I would recommend focusing on.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to take it to the next slide as well, because I think that this is related to it as far as quality assurance on best practices. So kind of speaking from your experience, Brian, on some of those issues, how have you supported the departments in making sure that that information is being communicated consistently and accurately?
Yeah, I think, we have had multiple ways that we've done it. I think we had a presentation that everybody followed to lead that forward to ensure that that information was covered through training. Also, we've actually had where those team members in those areas come out and speak when we have tours and groups on campus, but also then follow up through email, social media, our website, making sure those communications are coming through on those topics as well. So those are just some quick ways that we have done it, and highlighting some of those areas that are most important for the families and students to make that ultimate decision.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be something that would really be critical, because you want to hear it directly from the people that are doing that. So having them share that information directly and scheduling that time is a great way to do that. And I know that we had previously talked about leveraging technology, and we didn't actually have your point here, Brian, on the social media, but I would want to add that in there. So not just Zoom check-ins or TeamSync or automated nudges or follow-ups, but also just having that information available where they might be hanging out. Now, I don't know if students are hanging out on their school social media, but you never know. They might have their push notifications turned on. So just making sure that we're always having that information there and that we communicate with them where they are. So tech gives the quietest student a voice. Maybe they don't feel comfortable coming into the office. Maybe they definitely don't want to get on a Teams call, but maybe they'll be open to texting with someone. So ensuring that your team has the tools to communicate with students in various situations. And I know that we are getting close to the end of our time. We really have wrapped up just about everything. A lot of these are just putting a bow on our topics before, but it really is about speaking the language of the students and their families, and like Brian said, their support systems. So I do want to wrap up and make sure that we have time to ask for questions. And then if you have any additional questions, you can definitely drop them in the Q&A. But we also, when we send out our slides, we'll have our contact us. If you want to see more topics like this, just let us know. If you want to see topics centered or specifically centered on portions of this, please let us know. We're always happy to share the information that we have and to share what we've gleaned from our fantastic panelists. And I do want to open it up to the panel one last time before we close out. We have a few minutes left to Melanie and the rest of the team to just see if there's any final thoughts that you had that came up as we were wrapping up the presentation that you'd like to share with everyone. All right, you've just wrung them dry. We really, truly appreciate all the panelists being willing to share their time today. And thank you, Melanie, for being a fantastic co-presenter with me. And thank you, everyone, for bearing with us with our technical difficulties at the beginning. And we hope that you will join us again for our next session. Stay tuned, follow us on socials to see what that next topic will be, and follow our friends who are on this panel to connect with them and share your experiences. We'd love to hear more. We'll leave the Q&A and the presentation up for just another minute or two. If you have any burning questions, please drop them in the Q&A. Otherwise, thank you everyone so much for attending today. All right, I'm not going to put on a song and dance, so I'm going to go ahead and end the session. And thank you everyone so much.